everyone, and welcome to this Brisbane Writers Festival online conversation. My name is Michaela Kalowski. I'm an interviewer and facilitator, and it's my great pleasure to be here in conversation with Evie Wyld. I wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am tonight, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where the Brisbane Writers Festival home base is, the Yuggera and the Turrbal people, the traditional custodians of that land. On behalf of Brisbane Writers Festival, I acknowledge and welcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are watching, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's my enormous pleasure to be in conversation with Evie Wyld, award-winning author, about her latest novel, The Bass Rock. It's been described as a multi-generational modern Gothic triumph. Every page of this novel settles into your mind with quiet horror at the generations of violence and domination and pain visited upon humans by those closest to them. It's also a story about family in all its forms. It's a supernatural story, and it brilliantly and disturbingly traces patterns of abuse in communities and throughout English culture. It's unputdownable and it's unforgettable. I want to tell you first about Evie Wyld before we get going. Evie is the author of 3 novels. Her first, After the Fire, A Still Small Voice. Her second, All the Birds Singing, and her latest, The Bass Rock. She's been shortlisted for the Orange Prize for New Writers, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the International Dublin Literary Award. In 2013, she was listed as one of Granta's best young British novelists. Her second novel was longlisted for the Stella Prize, the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, and shortlisted for the Costa Novel Award and the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. She's also the winner of the 2013 Encore Award, the Jerwood Fiction Uncovered Prize, and the 2014 Miles Franklin Award. Her graphic novel, Everything is Teeth, with illustrator Joe Sumner, was published in 2015. She's also part owner of Review, a small independent bookshop in London. She grew up in Australia and the United Kingdom, and she lives in London, where she is right now. Welcome, Evie.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with exactly where the Bass Rock is. Where is that in the world?
So it's in Scotland. It's right on the coast, quite close to Edinburgh. That's sort of the closest big train stop. And it's a sort of golf coursey, windswept landscape. I think the thing that always interested me about it as a kid was that they've sort of papered over this really wild coast with a golf course, and it's quite a famous golf course. I think Trump goes there, which is, not that that's something to shout about, but I think it's, the beach itself is like, it's got tar on it, and the sand kind of makes your ankles bleed as it gets kind of thrown at them with the wind, and it's beautiful, but it stinks as well. And they've tried to make it very English and seasidey.
And it has a particular history as well. Before I sat down to do this conversation, I started sort of looking, noodling around about the Bass Rock, and it's got a history in that area of people hunting witches and burning witches.
It does. It has a little old church called St Andrew's Old Kirk, where about 70 people were accused of witchcraft in, I think, around about 1590. James VI was crossing on a boat to go to Denmark to get his new bride, and there were storms, and somebody kind of whispered in his ear, it's probably witches. So he came back and accused, tortured and executed a whole bunch of people, mainly women, but yeah, and then from there on got sort of obsessed with witches, and he's kind of thought of as quite a good king, other than this little blip. But yeah, it's a really strange place. You can still see St Andrew's Old Kirk, and it feels like a very old place.
Have you been there? Is this a place you've walked on and set foot in? Did it give you the heebie-jeebies?
I like the heebie-jeebies, so they don't. They kind of don't come in the same way. I think I seek out the heebie-jeebies or the willies if you're English. But it's a place that I used to go as a kid, and I had a great aunt, a really grand great aunt, who lived just on the golf course in a huge house, which is basically the house it's set in. And you know, so there's that kind of history of being there, and it wasn't a place for kids at all. You know, you were supposed to be very quiet and go out on the beach in all weather and just sort of stay there until it was dark and then come back in. And then when my father died about 8 years ago, I was looking through his photographs, and I knew that he'd been there as well as a kid. And there are all these photographs which are essentially exactly the same photograph, but of him as a small child with the Bass Rock in the background, as there are of me, except he's wearing a woolen swimming costume, which is a bit different. But so the Bass Rock itself is uninhabited, and it's a volcanic plug, so it's this odd shape, and it's got a huge colony of gannets on it, like the biggest colony in the world, so it's really smelly and loud and strange. And throughout history there was a hermit that lived on it. It was a prison for Catholics. It's got this weird past. So it's just always interested me that, you know, so much changes and that there's this big rock in the middle of it that stays the same.
Your first two novels were set in Australia or have a big connection to the Australian landscape. Why did you choose, I mean, you've talked about it already, it's an incredibly kind of enticing and rich and dark place, the Bass Rock, but what drew you to wanting to set this novel in Scotland and England?
I think, having always thought that I will always write about Australia, I think I just needed something different, but in a way I've done exactly what I did with the other two novels, which is start with my family and the stories within my family and kind of branch out from there. It wasn't that I sort of sat down to write about Scotland at all. It just ended up that the action happened there. When I write, I don't have much of an idea of what I'm doing ever, so it's just a big old mess, and then it turns out that Scotland is something that replays, and often it's these places of childhood that I come back to, I think. I think that's where most of the good stories are, really.
Of childhood in terms of your own childhood, or thinking about your family's childhoods?
I normally start with my own and like think about the tones and the atmosphere of parts of childhood. You know, the bits way back where you don't quite remember, and some of the memories might be passed on because you've been told a story several times and you can't be quite sure. I like probing at those bits, and I just turned 40 and suddenly that feels like a long way away, and, you know, feels like history. So that's sort of where I start, but then, you know, looking at the people sort of around you in a setting, it becomes more like a sort of bit of detective work, I think. And I think especially this is the first book that I've written since my father died, and after someone dies you can kind of be more nosy about them and learn more about them. And so that enabled a lot of, you know, family chats.
That you'd never had before?
Yeah, that like would feel sort of disrespectful to kind of bring it, and also until you don't realise the sort of vast number of unanswered questions you have until somebody's gone, and not that he would ever have answered any of them when he was alive, but you just suddenly realise all of these people that you think of as that you know them quite well, that of course they had a whole life before you came along and you only saw little strands of it anyway. So yeah, that kind of got me going.
When you sat down to write The Bass Rock, what was happening in your life? Did that feed into the kind of novel this became? Yeah, so I just had a baby, and which is for me very chaotic. Sure other people glide through it, but I think if they do, they're lying. But yeah,
good, thank you. But I was having, I've always been a very solitary person and have always enjoyed that kind of, the long day stretching out ahead of you and, writing little bits here and there, and having to sort of condense all that into a 1 hour nap when you're sleep deprived. I think it really focused the mind, is one way of putting it. And so I would just sit down to write when he was asleep, and I didn't have time to think deeply about what I was going to write, where I was going to write about, what sort of the plot might be, what issues or whatever I was concerned with, and so I just wrote what was at the front of my brain every time I sat down, which is probably why it took me 6 years to write, but it was just lots and lots of fragments, and I was, it felt quite self-indulgent, because it was just, I'm interested in this, maybe it'll fit into something later on. And it wasn't until quite far into writing it, when Me Too happened, that I kind of saw that all of these strands were the same thing, and that witch hunting really hasn't gone away, it's just changed shape slightly.
I want to talk to you about those things, because there are extraordinary women in the book. We meet 3 different women in different generations. Ruth, right after World War II, Sarah, who is somewhere in the 1700s, I think, or maybe even earlier, and Vivian, who's kind of a contemporary character of ours. So they're utterly compelling, and they're very nuanced women and very nuanced characters. Where did they come from? I suppose you mentioned now that the Me Too movement had been happening all around you during the time you were writing. What had you been thinking about when you wrote those 3 women in particular?
I think, so starting from the sort of modern day strand, that's really the most self-indulgent bit. That's me, very thinly veiled, sort of screwing up all over the place. So that was really good fun to write, because I've always shied away from putting myself in there, because it feels incredibly awkward and embarrassing, and I thought, well, own the awkwardness. So that was good fun in a way. And then the 1950s strand with Ruth, she is a thinly veiled version again of my grandmother, my British grandmother, who was, when I knew her, this very tall, chain-smoking, cut glass kind of English woman, said things like, "It's perfectly ghastly, darling," and, and was very funny and very smart, but very unhappy, really depressed, had never done anything with her life, was born into sort of upper middle class family, and because she was the girl, nothing was expected of her. And she had this brilliant brain, and she, by the time I knew her, she was an angry alcoholic, and she dried out in her mid-70s and finally died about 6 months after my father in her 90s. And so because I had my father's kind of point of view of her, I sort of adopted that she was basically this sort of old cow, like the bad part of the family. And then after she died, I, again, with the photo albums, I inherited her photo albums. Everybody leaves them to me because I'm interested in that stuff. And there are all these pictures of her on her honeymoon, looking all sexy and vivacious and interested and switched on. And I think it just made me think about a different version of her that I hadn't known. And then what makes somebody that version of herself. So it started out as trying to rewrite history for her, trying to give her another version, and then she kind of morphed into her own person. It's sort of trying to get to know someone you can't have known. But she had a quite an interesting sort of storyline, my grandmother, which is the same as Ruth in the book, that she, when she was quite young, married an older man who was bereaved and had 2 young boys, and then she was a terrible mother. And so, yeah, it was sort of that kind of complication of family that really drew me to that storyline, I think.
I want to come to the character of Ruth. It's really interesting to hear that she's sort of attached in some way to someone who was a part of your family story as well. And I want to talk about that English culture that you just gave us such a good example of with the perfectly ghastly. Before we go on, we have to sort of acknowledge that there's a lot. The book is a very dark book in a lot of ways. It's dark for the reason you just touched on, which is that it's a lot about women who have no agency, or women who are not, in the time of Ruth's, right after World War II, she's not expected to have any kind of purpose. Her life is really aimless, and she's very bright, and it makes her sense of dislocation much greater. But all the way through the book, there's also these really distressing stories of abuse, mostly sexual abuse, but all kinds of abuse, domination, control, the expression of fear in people, and it's mostly directed toward women. And it's not the first time you've written about that in your novels. It's come up before. And I wondered, was there something you were trying to understand in particular when you were writing The Batroc?
Well, I think there's this funny thing that happens when you write a novel, and I've spoken to a few other writers about it, that you set out to write this thing and you don't know quite what it looks like, but you kind of know what you want to say within it, and then you write it for years, and then you get to the end of it and it's finished and you're like, that's not really what I meant, and it's just something else. And so I think my first book and my second book were kind of in the same arena, because you don't write yourself out of being interested in something. It's always something that is within you and sort of ticking away. So I feel like The Batroc is perhaps more what I meant. It still had that dissatisfaction of, I could have written this for many more years, and everything's going to continue. Nothing's going to get, despite the fact that we are all switched on. We've got Me Too. It's going to take hundreds of years to undo the thousands of years that we come from. So I think, I don't think I'll ever stop being interested in writing about those things, because they're so part of women's experience, daily experience. And I was really thinking about the sort of fatigue of vigilance, that thing of walking down the street and in the back of your mind scanning to work out who's going to pass by you, who they are, do they look dangerous. And that's not a woman being paranoid or jumpy. That's just daily life. You have to think about these things. And those moments when you're talking to someone and you just get this scratchy little feeling that something's not right, and you are we're so brought up to ignore that and be polite and be kind and be generous with our time and be generous with ourselves, that we ignore those witchy parts of ourselves that are there to keep us safe. Our intuition, which is a real thing because we've had to develop it over hundreds and hundreds of years in order to not be burnt at the stake or something. So I think those things, the smaller things really interest me, and it's those smaller things that make way for the bigger things, like the murders that are in the book. And I have many, many more of those which aren't in the book that I wrote. And a lot of them seem quite gentle, but they just have a little kernel of something not quite right that most women would have experienced. And I think it also came out of talking with a lot of women. I had my drink spiked years ago at a publishing party, which you would think you would be the safest place on earth, and it's a very strange thing having your drink spiked, because the nature of the drug means that you doubt yourself, and as if women didn't have enough doubt within them anyway. And it really sort of plays on that. And I was really lucky that nothing too bad happened. I managed to get home. But when I started talking about it a bit with my friends and being like, I don't know if this thing happened, but, you know, X, Y, Z happened. The amount of them who had had far worse experiences of having their drinks spiked, it was nearly all of them. And that got us talking about, you know, being masturbated at on tubes, or, you know, being afraid walking down the street, and just these endless stories of sort of small fry really in comparison to actually being raped or murdered or any of that stuff, but they are so present within women's lives, within women's daily lives, and it's all about that you know, wadding down the anger and ignoring that witchiness, ignoring the fact that you don't want to let the gas man into your house, or you don't want to, I don't know, have to explain to someone what the novel you're reading is about on public transport, that encroach on us and kind of pave the way for worse things.
You're right about that, what you've just described, in these very different time periods, which I want to talk to you about in a moment. But even in Ruth's marriage, you know, that there were examples of when she knows, for example, that her husband is, or she's pretty sure her husband is having an affair, and she tries to confront him with that, and he just flat out denies it in a way that completely denies not only what she's saying to him literally, but also her sense of reality, her sense of perspective. And it sounded a lot like gaslighting, which is what we call it now. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on this, whether some of that behaviour, the behaviour you're describing that makes women feel, that puts women at risk, that makes women unsafe in the communities they live in, walking down a street, getting on the tube, catching a boat, even going to a fairly safe publishing party, whether those things are worse in the context of certain cultures. So, for example, in the book, it's this very repressed English culture, very repressed and very repressive. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on whether there was a correlation between those, where you're not supposed to have any emotion, you're not supposed to have big responses to things.
I think it sort of breeds sort of man-childs, you know. I think not being able to admit emotions to yourself means you have to cut out a huge section of yourself. And also, you know, having been in the wars and only being allowed to talk about the heroics of that and nothing else, not being able to admit fear, that sort of thing. I think it breeds these sort of toddlerish people who, when faced with any kind of confrontation, are just like, no, I didn't do it, and you're horrid for suggesting it in the first place. And I think there's a lot of that, especially my grandfather's generation, and therefore my father's generation, because, you know, the trickle-down effect. But yeah, I think anything that encourages a human being to cut something out of themselves is going to produce huge effects down the line. Just like, again, bringing it back to women and how they are, how we're brought up to be so polite and to hug the relative that we don't feel right about. And then, you know, and then there's tickling, which is a whole other problem. And yeah, I think any time you're denying what you instinctively feel, I think it produces something really unhealthy and quite frightening.
I'm thinking about, you mentioned tickling. There's two very uncomfortable and very unnerving tickling kind of scenes in the book. One with Vivian in contemporary time, and one with Ruth on a picnic on the beach, where it's kind of like a community kind of picnic where the women have to dress up and the men have to dress up, but the women have to not reveal who they are and they sort of have to hide and be found. And I wondered if, that, as you just described it, that kind of cultural expression of completely dampening down parts of your own psyche, as you say, post-war, you're not allowed to be afraid and you're not allowed to grieve and you're not allowed to mourn. Do you think that kind of cultural expression informed the way your characters made sense of the abuse that was done to them? I'm thinking of Ruth and of Christopher and Michael, her stepsons as well, who had a very terrible time at their boarding school in the novel.
I think there's a particular Britishness that is like, well, that's just life, isn't it? You know, that's how one behaves, and you know, you might have a terrible time at boarding school, but you'd still send your child there because that's what's done. That's what one does. I think the comfort is in just repeating the past from what I've seen of my English family anyway.
Even if the past was horrible and abusive?
Almost, especially if the past was horrible and abusive, because it shut off to you then. And I think my father was kind of broke out of that. He took an awful lot of drugs at school, and he to kind of cope with it all. And he he had many trickier things about him, but he was so attuned when I was a child to homesickness. So I was a bit of a wimpy kid and didn't like staying at other people's houses, and, you know, was a bit sort of quiet and strange. And I would pretty much always, if I was staying over at a friend's house, when I was sort of 8 or 9, sneak out of the room in the middle of the night and call, 2:00 in the morning, and he wouldn't ask any questions. He'd hop in the car, he'd come and get me, slip a note through the letterbox to say, Evie felt unwell, I took her home. And there was never any kind of I was never reprimanded for that kind of wimpy behaviour. It was like, because he knew instinctively that kind of pit of the stomach feeling, and he couldn't cope with, he would have just lain there awake thinking about it. So he kind of managed to break free of it in some ways, but the multiple damages that he experienced, never left him.
You mentioned that pit of the stomach feeling, and you talked about that witchy feeling that all women have, that as you say, we've spent thousands of years developing, that eerie sense of something not being right, that maybe has been tried to be bred out of us under the idea of sophistication or elegance. So it's a good moment to ask you about all the supernatural elements in this story, because there are a lot of them. There are ghosts, people who see ghosts, people who don't want to see ghosts. And there's a really fantastic character called Maggie who calls herself a witch, and she's almost the only force of good in the whole story. She's the only person who can sort of achieve any good.
It's really annoying though.
She is, but I was so grateful she was there. Maggie and any kind of mallet or hammer, I was a happy girl. But I wanted to ask you why you're drawn to writing about those supernatural elements. I mean, the book on its own, without, say we were to take all those strands out, if one could, would still be absolutely riveting and memorable and eerie. But with those aspects, for people who haven't read the book yet, there's a suggestion of a ghost in the house that Ruth lives in World War, just after World War II, who's been there for a long time. Maggie, this character who Vivian meets in real time, has a sense of people, has a sense of when danger's coming, has a sense of things. She's also got this incredible sense of what's happened in a place. It's almost like she can tune in to the memory, the sense memory of a place. Why did you bring those supernatural strands in to this story?
Well, so it's a funny thing. I'm an atheist, so I don't believe in afterlife at all, but I do believe that people see ghosts, and I think it's all to do with the brain and a bunch of stuff we don't understand yet, but the desire to hop straight to it's my granny coming to make sure that I don't date the wrong guy or something always seems a bit sort of disappointing, and I'm a huge fan of all those shonky true ghost story shows where there's a woman who's like, and the ghost pushed me down the stairs, and her husband's sitting next to her going, yes, it was the ghost. I think people can enact stuff through ghosts. I don't know, I just think there's something so interesting about the moments that people experience them. And I should add into that we actually a year after my son was born, we fled a house that we owned. We had a flat in London, and we moved out because I became so convinced that we had a ghost, despite not believing any of it. And there's a moment in the book where Ruth walks into a room and all the furniture's on the ceiling, except she knows that it's not. She can see that everything's completely normal in the room, but she has this tremendous sense of it all being up in the air. And she has this tremendous sense of a young girl being in the corner, and except she can see with her eyes that there's no one there. And that is all based on what was happening in our flat, with, huge sleep deprivation and angst and postnatal depression and all of that stuff. And I just think it's so interesting that that's how your brain responds to the sort of trauma of having a baby, or this new life that your brain is permanently altered, and now you have to think about all the sort of awful ways that your child can die all the time. And I think it felt like in me it sort of unlocked something, but it also my husband also started to experience things, and so it seems like a ridiculous thing to say, I'm an atheist, yeah, I moved out of my flat because there was a ghost in it, but
it doesn't sound ridiculous or more convincing.
Yeah, maybe. It's always the unbeliever who gets haunted the most. But yeah, so it's something that's always interested me, and my family have a lot of ghost stories that they've always told, direct experiences and like really lovely, specific, horrible things that don't have a proper wrapped up ending. That's what I love is when it's just something alarming happens and nobody knows why, and you'll never find out. I think that's great.
Well, it sounds in that way that ghosts are like a perfect metaphor for what life is like. It's not neat, and it's often inexplainable, good things and bad things. The ghost that appears to Ruth, who you describe that so powerfully in the book, it's very, very, it's quite frightening, but eventually that ghost sort of ends up being a sort of a character almost of solace. What do you think, what were you thinking that ghost represented for Ruth? How did that help Ruth kind of settle into the place she was in? Because she goes through a sort of a process of being very frightened and doubting herself, to even starting to talk to and engage with that ghost she thinks she sees or does see in the room.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's about talking again. It's about women sharing experience, and if the book as a whole, it is a dark book, and it is could be seen as a bit of a downer. It's got a high body count, but if there's hope within it, which I hope there is, it's that by talking, women have this power to I don't know if you're familiar with My Favourite Murder, the podcast. They have a catchphrase which is fuck politeness, and I think that has probably saved the lives of hundreds of women, because just being given that agency back, that somebody has said this, that you notice in yourself that you're you'd almost get into a car with someone because you didn't want to offend them, that sort of thing that is sort of smashed into us as little girls, and once you're given the power to say, no, actually I'm not gonna follow that route, then there's so much power that women have that it feels like it's all sort of boiling away, and I feel like the younger generations, my younger cousins, blow me away with how confident they are and how they know their rights, and they know when somebody is being inappropriate, and they call them out on it, in all sorts of ways, racism as well as everything else, wearing a mask. They've been armed with confidence, and I think that comes through speaking.
There are very big generational shifts, definitely. I wondered if we could just talk a little bit about Maggie before we move on. As I said before, she's, when we first meet Maggie in the book, she sort of saves Vivian from what could have been a very bad, violent or other attack, a man, creeping behind her car late at night in a shopping centre car park. But Maggie seems to be almost like a force of good, like a counterbalance to all the evil in the book. Did you see her in that way?
I did. I saw her as, she's sort of like... She balances dangerously on a sort of pixie dream girl tightrope. I think there's. I think any time she seemed a little bit too vivacious, I kind of tried to rein it in by making her a bit grotty. But what she really is the kind of stuff together all of the bits of Vivian that she wishes she had. So the confidence to kind of follow her life as she follows her instincts. She lives sort of day by day following exactly what she feels she's drawn to, and she's loud and quite obnoxious. I mean, the idea of asking somebody you don't know, what do you do for a living, and they're just like, oh, I'm a witch, is sort of lovely, but also it takes an enormous confidence to say that. So yeah, I think there were moments writing the book where I was a bit like, is she actually Viv's alter ego? Is this a split personality thing? But she was so strong in my mind that she had to be her own person. But she stands in for an aggression, a sort of positive aggression, I think.
All throughout the book as well, you talk about foxes and wolves, and some of the children talk about, the wolf man is coming, the wolf man's at the door, the wolf man being this terrifying proposition. And even characters throughout different times say about a man or about each other, are you a fox or a wolf? What did that represent for you? What did you want to play around with when you were giving characters those two different animals to compare?
I think wolves have such an interesting history. It's the most, being chased through the woods by a wolf, it kind of stands in for all the fear of everything, doesn't it? It's being eaten alive, all of that stuff. I guess it's a British shark. And
very good analogy, a British shark.
Yeah, it's how I have to look at everything. So it's their kind of, I suppose they're like a mythical monster in the UK. We don't have them anymore, and we haven't had them for a very long time. But that sort of pack mentality is interesting and feels relevant to groups of men and also groups of sort of groupings of thought and I don't know. And I think foxes, they are so present in London anyway. They're confident and mangy, and they're in and out of your life like squirrels and rabbits and all of the kind of wildlife landscape that you stop noticing because it's so prevalent. And so I guess there's something there about just the sort of saturation of sorry, there goes the pipes, or a ghost. There's a sort of saturation of them that interests me, and they're sneaky, and they do disgusting things, like that through the stuff they eat, the way they kill things. I think they're so like us in that way, that they've just always interested me, and people either seem to hate them or think they're beautiful, I think there's an in-between thing that's interesting.
You do something very interesting in this book as well, something very powerful, in that you jump between times. And they, by 25 pages into the book, they've started to illuminate the other time periods that we're in, and we start to get more and more detail building up. But you give us a chance to get to know characters as themselves, not as the daughter of, or the son of, or the mother of, which is a very trusting way to let a reader get to know a character. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you structured the book when you were writing it. I know you said before sometimes you just sit down and write. But did you write all of Ruth's story and then all of Sarah's story and interweave them? Or how did that happen for you when you were structuring the book?
Yeah, well, so I think I've written all 3 books in a similar way, in that respect that I think I started with Ruth, but then in order to know who she was, I kind of started looking at her parents. There was a lot more about her parents and her siblings. There was a whole other character, which was her dead brother who was killed in the war, which is exactly the same as my grandmother's situation, and he was sort of looming really large in her memory, and he was gay, and it was all kind of, there was almost another book in there. There were several other books in there actually, and what I find is that these different strands become like in conversation with each other. So the sort of echoes that you can put down the line that may or may not be kind of revealed in the present day as like a big deal, or the misunderstanding of what somebody 50 years ago was trying to do. Those things really fascinate me, because as humans, what we want to do most of all is to be able to describe someone in a sentence. And, if anyone out there who's written books and you're asked to describe what your book is about, it's kind of like, I don't know, a bunch of stuff. And that's the same with people. They're these complex, unknowable things. They don't know themselves. I'm saying this as if I'm not a human being, but we don't know, actually, I don't know what I think about stuff, which is why I write. And so writing becomes a way of exploring things and looking at people and trying to figure out how humans work. So structure-wise, one of the reasons that my books end up having what seems like quite a complicated structure is because I feel like people and life is so complex that it deserves something. It makes sense to lose a reader a little bit in the text, and I certainly enjoy reading that kind of book. It's like, I like it when a writer has the confidence to know that you'll follow them, which isn't really an answer about how I structured it, but it's sort of, it was a mess, and part of my process is I write and write and write, and then I have maybe 150,000 words, and they're all disparate and scattered about, and really putting the novel together quite near to the end, quite close to finishing it, is structuring it and finding my way out of a maze, really. There's always a point at which I feel like, oh, this isn't a novel at all. I've just gone mad for 6 years and now I'm drowning in paper. And it feels impossible. I think also, if you think about, I think the way that we write must have changed so much now that we've got these little laptops that, we kind of think about our novels as being that big because that's how much we can see at a time. So at some point I print everything out and literally cut and paste it with scissors and glue and work out where things go and have a colour code thing that never works and get really confused. I get very confused a lot.
It sounds like it will work. It sounds enormously creative. You could pretend.
Well, I think as long as you keep going with it, something will come out the other end.
Very true. You mentioned before that you love reading books yourself where the author has been courageous enough to trust you as a reader. Who are the authors that you love to read, who do that, who keep you enthralled but don't tell you everything?
Well, I guess, not to play to the crowd too much, but I mean, the one that really stands out in my head is Tim Winton's The Riders. That book, I feel like that book helped me to write my first novel, and I always keep it in the back of my head that there's so much he doesn't reveal, and you just have to follow him. And you're desperate to know how they managed to get off the plane and the wife not be there, and what happened to her, and has she been taken, has she been murdered, has she left him, all this sort of stuff. And so it's all in the muteness of the child. It's all in the sort of stuff that he doesn't give us. That's a book that I always return to. But more recently, Megan Hunter is a fantastic writer, and she writes very, very slim, spare novels. They're almost like little vignettes the whole way through. And again, it almost seems to be like she leaves out as many words as she possibly can. And because of that, this beautiful thing, you pour yourself into it as a reader. You bring your own experience to it, and that makes it all the more kind of horrifying. She's got a new book coming out over here in a couple of months called The Harpy, which is all about a woman turning into a harpy after having some kids and finding out that her husband is having an affair, and she just physically turns into a harpy. That's brilliant.
Sounds absolutely brilliant.
It is.
I want to ask one thing before we sort of get toward the end, which is that we've spoken a lot today about the thousands of years of control of women and violence toward women and sexual violence over women. One of the characters in the Basrock has a murder map of unsolved crimes where women have been killed and just sort of dumped. But, we've talked a lot about the things that women do to keep themselves safe and the conversations that we can have with each other. But did you come to any recollection, any ideas or insights about why we have this history of violence between men and women? Why men hurt women in the way that they do and have done for thousands of years?
I mean, I think there's often a moment in interviews that I do where there's this kind of awkward moment where the interviewer is like, but obviously we don't mean all men, and I feel like I have to go, no, of course, like, my lovely son, my husband, they're all nice, and my friends and colleagues, but actually what I want to say is it is in fact all men, because what chance do they have born into a world where it's in the air, and it is so prevalent, they can't help but absorb it. In the same way that the world is racist, and there are no non-racists, there are only anti-racists. I think the same, not to draw a line too strongly between those two things, but I just think the way it's talked about is really helpful, that once we realise that it is everywhere, and that and that's not to condemn all men, but it's to say they're struggling with it too. It's not good for them. That's one of the reasons that they're not allowed to speak about the horrors of war, that they're not allowed to cry, that, it's still so fantastically taboo if a man cries. It's, the most awkward thing in the world, which is insane. And yeah, I mean, I obviously don't have any answers, otherwise I'd be King Bum, but I think, I just think, there's power in women talking to each other, and there's great power to be had in men talking to each other. Highly unlikely, I think. The conversations that women have compared to the conversations that men have, it seems to be, if you look at the example of a parent dying and you go out with your female friends and you talk about the person who's died and you cry and you kind of thrash things out, and then the same with men, and it often tends to be like solace in silence, in watching the footy, and let's just have a drink but let's not mention the thing. And I think that's not men's fault. That is what they've been born into, and it must be horrendous for them. And then that comes out in all sorts of terrible ways. And so, yeah, I think everything is about reading and talking and, the same old stuff that everything's about. But no answers, unfortunately.
That was a pretty good answer. I'm glad. The bass rock has really stayed with me. There are so many moments in the novel that I can't get out of my mind and out of my heart. And it's deeply unsettling, but very rewarding to read as well. Do your books stay with you as well?
Do you know what this one has? Normally by the time I've finished one, I'm like, right, on to the next, and I've already started sort of thinking about someone else, another character, while I'm finishing up the end of the novel I'm working on. But this one, I don't know if it's because it feels a bit more like what I meant to write, or because it took me so much longer than the others, but I still feel very much in the space of that book, even though I finished writing it. I haven't worked on it for a year or so, and it's a strange thing thinking about what I'll write next, because part of me is worried that if they were all about that, are they all going to continue to be about that, and is it going to dry up a bit? But just have to see. Again, I think it's about trusting the process and just sitting down and writing what interests me at that moment.
Well, I want to say on behalf of Brisbane Writers Festival, thank you so much for all your ideas and for all the ways that your writing forces us to pay attention to our own intuition, to history, to all the kind of ideas of control and corruption, and to rally against them, both as readers and as thinkers. So thank you.
Thank you.
I want to say as well that Brisbane Writers Festival has more online events planned for the coming months, so please keep your eye on their website so you can hear about what's coming up next. But for now, thank you all very much for being part of this Brisbane Writers Festival online conversation.